I am Rebecca from ChemKnits and welcome to part 1 of our newest color challenge. I asked ChemKnits patrons to vote between a lot of different viewer suggested color combinations, and I am going to take the winner and use those 3 colors to create a lot of different colorways. I'll get into the colors in a moment, although you probably saw it on the thumbnail. But there are a few loose rules for the color challenges. In each of the different videos, I need to dye at least 3 separate types of colorways, but if I do something like a tonal or a set, that counts as 1 colorway. I can't use each of the 3 colors as a tonal and count that as 3. I should use all 3 colors in either every set or every colorway. And I am allowed to use the natural bare color of the yarn as a 4th color. Not all the colors need to be used in equal amounts, and some blending is okay, but in the first part of this color challenge, I'm going to attempt to avoid a lot of mixing, except for an intentional mixing, which I'm going to talk more about in just a moment. But now let's go look at our colors and make some stock solutions. The winning color combination was forest green, navy, and maroon. These are markers, not the best representations, but I have a navy, I have a forest green. Unfortunately, there used to be a maroon Derma acid dye, and that's not one that I have in my collection, and it's no longer available for purchase. So I picked Cabernet because I felt like it was a maroonish kind of color. Now granted, I absolutely could have gone maybe in some other different directions for that red, but this is our palette, and it's not really a challenging palette necessarily because these colors, just like even on the swatches, look so good together. But I am excited to dive in and play with these deeper tones. Now let's go make some stock solutions of these 3 colors so that way I can use them for the various projects. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator with P100 filters, safety glasses, and gloves, and then measured out 5 grams of each of these colors, crossing my fingers that I had enough in the jars to get 5 grams. Then I started dissolving the dye in some hot tap water and used a graduated beaker to dilute the dye to have a total volume of 500 milliliters. This would give us a 1% stock solution because we have 5 grams in 500 milliliters, or it's equivalent of 1 gram in 100 milliliters. And this is a very easy concentration to use to then make further calculations from. Now that our stocks are made, there are a lot of different techniques that you can do, and I played around with sketching some colors just with colorways with my markers. And one thing I know I want to do for sure is a triangle color mixing. I'm very curious to see which of these colors is more potent than the others, see what kind of beautiful fades we can get with different combinations of the 3. And so I think that that's going to be really, really fun and will help me determine what proportions I may want for some of these other techniques, whether in this video or in part 2. Our first colorway of the season is not really an official colorway. We're more starting off, our leave no dye behind. So there was some remnant color left over from our color mixing, and I saved it so that way we could use it. But this is a skein of Knit Pick Stroll fingering weight yarn, which is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. And I pre-soaked it in some water with acid. And so this is not giving us all over coverage, but actually the colors are sticking pretty quickly. And what I think I'm going to do is let this sit for a minute because it seems like it soaked up the color, but I'm gonna go to the sink and actually squeeze this out to remove that extra liquid. There, now we have a yarn that I can wipe my gloves on as we start the first official colorway, Countertop Speckles. But I'm also already intrigued and want to play with these 3 colors as pastels because I think that that is gorgeous. I decided to do speckles before even starting the color mixing because, well, I had the powders and my mask and everything all ready to go, but also because I know that these are 3 deep colors, and so they would look very, very well together just painting with dry powders. There's not really very much of a balance issue that I expect from these 3 colors. I am applying the dye with my dry gloved fingertips to 3 skeins of Knit Pick Stroll that was also pre-soaked in water with vinegar overnight. And I'm not worrying about trying to have the smallest, most microfine speckles. If I wanted the speckles to be really, really tiny, I would have mixed the dye with citric acid in advance. I don't mind if these speckles end up being a little bit bigger. And I also don't mind if they have a little bit of spread. My goal isn't to have all over coverage, but a fair amount of coverage is fine. I flipped the yarn on the counter multiple times, wiping my gloves on the yarn mop before switching colors, and then rinsing and drying my gloves before going into another dye container, because if your fingertips are damp when you go into dye powder, then you're gonna get more dye in your hands. Towards the end of the speckling, I knew that there was a lot of dye kind of sticking to the counter, and so I sort of lifted the skeins and patted it on there to help spread the dye a little bit. I wasn't rubbing, I was just patting. And it gave, I think, a nice little fun effect, and the colors spread a lot, and I'm very excited. Once I was satisfied with the coverage here, I took our yarn and put it inside a steamer basket to steam set for 30 minutes. Then, of course, all that dye on the counter, I used my yarn mop and wiped up the dye before going and actually washing it down, because there's a limit to how much dye the mop could hold. And then once my steamer basket was free, I added the yarn mop to the steamer basket to also steam set for 30 minutes. And then let both cool completely so I could wash them. Let's wash our first yarn mop, which is so beautiful. I love how that turned out. I'm so glad that I love my typical yarn mop style, but I'm so glad that it's so different. And we're also gonna wash the speckled yarn here, which you can see we had a lot of spread, but that's partially by design, partially because we were dyeing this on the countertop. And now, gotta cross my fingers that we're not gonna see any bleeding. Cabernet is not a color that I've used a lot. I use both the navy and forest green all the time, so I know more about what to expect from those. I'm now adding in just some dish soap. Of course, when I finally wash our 1% depth of shade yarn, that will be more of the test because it's hard to always know how much color and dye you have when you're doing speckles on a countertop, because it's easy to keep going and going. I will say the Cabernet is leaning a bit purple, a bit more purple than maybe I was anticipating. Which isn't bad. I just wish it was a bit more red. Did I include this when I did my purple way back in the day? I'm not sure. It's looking very, very purple to me, but maybe because of the navy with it. But anyway, I'm not seeing any bleeding, so I am gonna finish rinsing out the soap, put the yarn through my spin dryer, and hang it up to dry. For our color mixing, we are going to use 20-gram mini skeins of Wool to Dye For's titanium sock, which is a high twist 2-ply yarn that is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. And the 20-gram minis is the biggest difference between this triangle and the other triangles I have done on this channel. And so since we have 20-gram mini skeins and we want a total depth of shade of 1%, which means we want 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn. Since we have 20 grams of yarn, we need 0.2 grams of dye total. All of the dye stocks that I mixed are a 1% stock, and so 0.2 grams of dye would be equivalent to 20 milliliters. So I'm gonna want 20 milliliters total of dye in each of my various containers. And for each of the colors, we're gonna set it up this way. We're gonna forest green at 20, 15, 10, 5, and then 0. For the navy, 20, 15, 10, 5, 0. And then the Cabernet, 20, 15, 10, 5, and 0. So for each of the colors, we'll have a 1-to-1 ratio, and then we'll have 3 that are combinations of all 3, and we'll get to see what the dominant color is in this set. My prediction is that it might be pretty well balanced, and I think I'm really excited. So let's set up and start mixing. I laid out 15 containers on my countertop, and I had 1 cup of just plain tap water, no acid yet, in each of them. And then using graduated syringes to help measure out the volumes of dye, I started adding the dye to each of the cups as I showed in the previous clip, with a total of 20 milliliters of dye total in each cup. I am really excited about this. The colors are so dark you can't really tell much at this stage. So I'm gonna go ahead and start adding the colors in. So not only will we see how these colors blend, but we are gonna have a 1% depth of shade of the 3 main colors we are using here today. And that is really, really useful. Plus, eventually when we wash it, we'll see how things, I guess, wash. But I do, ooh, this is like a purpley color. I do need to add all of the yarn before we can really start to get a feel of what these colors are, just because the containers are so opaque that I can't really tell what the hues are like. But my first impression, I think that the reds are gonna be very dominant. That Cabernet may be our most pigmented color, which stands with what we've seen when we've done this with primaries. Reds often are the most pigmented, just by nature of wanting something to look red instead of pink. There's a reason why, the green might be the least pigmented. There's a reason why a lot of dye brands have multiple reds in their collections. But I will poke all these in more in a moment. It'll just be easier once I don't have all of the yarn on my hand. Ooh, I think that the color right there, I can tell is already going to be one that I really love. And ooh, I think the Cabernet is going to be way more potent than our navy. So this is good to know when I do layering later on. Maybe I'll use less of the Cabernet, or maybe we'll do something based on like this proportion right here. But I'm now going to quickly tap all the yarn in the various containers, wiping off my spoon after each one to try to not contaminate the colors. I think on camera it's hard to get a read on it. I would say that the combination of the navy and forest green is superb. I really like it. One other note is sometimes the navy does look a little bit purple until you heat it. So we may see some shift in the colors from what they look like right now. The forest green is definitely the least pigmented color. You can see that it looks like this is getting lighter as we go up. A lot of these with Cabernet are very, very similar. There are definitely some that are a bit more purple, like this row right here overall, but I mean, this one is a little more brown. There are differences for sure. And so we may even be able to make more conclusions once the dye has set. We still need acid, and I'm gonna add a tablespoon of white vinegar to each of these samples. This is a lot of acid. I don't think I absolutely need this much, but these colors are saturated and the Cabernet is making me a little nervous. I will be honest, but I am so excited to see what these colors look like. And so the approach that I am doing now is a cool process, a cold process, cool vat style of dyeing. And that is where I am going to let the yarn and dye sit for a couple of days to let these colors absorb to the yarn at room temperature. It'll be a slower absorption, and ooh, The navy definitely got more navy with the addition of acid even, so maybe it's not heat. But I now see more of a difference between some of these colors. That's pretty. By letting the colors absorb while they are cold, this just means that I can steam them all at once, and so that will be a little bit easier. So that is just the reasoning there. But I'm gonna finish mixing these up, and then I am going to put lids on them that have them numbered so I know which one is which, and I'm gonna set them aside for a couple of days. If it were summer, I would move them outside and then do it just overnight. But since it is winter and my house is not that warm, I figure a little more time will not hurt anything at all. So I will come back once all the dye has absorbed, or not, and then we need to figure out something else. That is also something we may find out. It is currently Sunday, and I believe that I set this up on a Thursday. Now I've checked, I guess, our navy and our Cabernet, and I know that there is still a little bit of color there, but most of the color is in the yarn. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and remove the lids, and we're gonna go ahead and start heat setting these samples. But everything left, I have an idea of what we're gonna do with whatever is left in the cups. It's so hard to tell what is going on here because, I mean, I'll just say, you can see the green here. This row, I can kind of see the difference between this whole bit looks very, 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 very similar. And it's hard to make any kind of conclusions. But I did want to show, so this was our navy, this is our forest green, and then this is our Cabernet. So there's a ton of pigment in each of those three colors. Right now, they are different, but we definitely have something left in, well, maybe not all of them. But we'll use whatever's left and try to use it and leave no dye behind to dye some yarn. But what I'm doing right now, instead of just immediately prepping it to go steam set, I want to remove all the samples in the right order so that way I can see if there's any subtle differences I can see now. Because pulling these ones out of the cups, I start to see something. Just taking a moment here. I think this next row, I mean, they're so similar. I can see a difference here for sure though. Okay, so we have a bunch of cups around us and things are very, very, very subtle. Like this row is very subtle, but I do see differences, and these two might be very, very similar. I see this is stunning. This is just a spectacular little set right there. Something that I would honestly replicate because I think that it's near perfect actually. This set would need something else to like bridge the blue a little bit, but I do see a bit of a progression there. So I think that we might see even more differences once it's dry. It's hard when it is wet. And I keep checking like the viewfinder of the camera, and I think that it is so extraordinarily subtle. But I'm now gonna start grouping them for steam setting. And I think our best chance to be able to tell what goes where is to keep the three from the middle together. Okay, so that's gonna be a group of 3. And then the rest I'm gonna divide into groups of 4. And I think I'm gonna do it like this. So this will be one group of 4, this will be one group of 4, and that'll be a group of 4. And so hopefully I should be able to put everything back together again. But now I'm just gonna go steam set this in a steamer basket for 30 minutes. All of the yarn is in the steamer basket on my stovetop. And once we finish steaming it after 30 minutes, I'll remove the yarn and let it cool completely so we can wash it. Let's wash these minis. And I'm gonna grab just about half of them. Let's start with all. You know, if we see bleeding, then we can separate them and do half and half. It's not a problem. And I'm seeing a little bit of some color at first, but this isn't actually concerning me because I think that there was some evidence of some insoluble particles with the Cabernet, unfortunately. So let's now add just some clear dish soap and cross fingers that we're just gonna rinse everything out. I don't know. I mean, not bad given the depth of color that we have here. So I'm gonna go ahead and keep rinsing this until the water is clear, assuming that that is gonna happen really soon. Then I'll put the yarn through my spin dryer and hang it up to dry. For our next colorway, I want to try to lean into some variegated pastels. And so since I think this color is the most pigmented, let's start with 10 milliliters of Cabernet, knowing that this may be too much. Now, at the time I'm filming this, and I don't know, it's probably out of order with how I'm showing it in the video, I have not yet heat set our tonals from the color mixing, and there is still some color left in some of them. And so, oh my gosh, this looks like a lot of color. But we will see, we will see. Okay, I'm gonna come in with some stroll. So the stroll has pre-soaked, and we are gonna start dip dyeing. Okay, this is not necessarily pastel. The goal is to go in about a third. Ooh, but this is behaving a little bit more tonal than I would like. And so the reason for dipping it is to try to help these strands. I've probably gone in a little further than I wanted to, but it's okay for the colors to layer a bit. I want us to try to get at least a bit of color on the interior, but we will see. It's a problem with dipping 3 versus 2 or 1. Okay, I am now gonna get a container to keep that other end in, because I don't know if we're gonna have color wicking out or not. But, well, I guess I should have said, this pot started with 16 cups of water and 4 tablespoons of white vinegar. And I was using this for another video and wanted to reuse the same pot. Okay, the color is all absorbing. So we'll start with a similar amount of the next color once it's time, but it's possible that we might need more to kind of balance this, but we're gonna see how things go. And I definitely covered this more than just a third. Okay, and yes, this did wick water into the other pan. Glad I used a pan. Most of this color has absorbed. And again, we're going for a more medium tone. There's a little bit left, and so this is not as dark and saturated as it could be. We're gonna start it with about 11 milliliters of navy. I would say this color still isn't quite pastel. For that, maybe we would need just like 1 milliliter of dye. I'm not even sure, but yeah, the navy I think is relatively strong. We might need more for it to feel on par with this Cabernet color, but it also depends on how much of it we dip in. And so now I need to move my zip ties. Okay, so I have moved the zip ties so we have a little bit of white at the top. This does mean that some of the Cabernet is going to go into the navy first, and so we will get some blending there, but this gives us the best chance of preserving some white for our forest green. And if we need to, we definitely, oh, where's my, shoot, tongs. We definitely can add more navy dye if we need to. But the goal is to move it around a fair amount. So I guess we're blending the colors more than I had originally intended. But that's okay. That is okay. Okay, so I don't know if I'm getting enough of the navy color where I wanted it. I guess so. All right, I am going to leave this in for, I think, about 15 minutes. I'm gonna pull it out a little bit. More of the yarn, I would say, is in the pot this time than last time, and we definitely have some more purple color. Who knows if we're gonna have some of the like pure Cabernet held on. The navy isn't as potent at all. I think that when I go to the spruce, ooh, I'm torn. Maybe I should stick with the 10 milliliters and then we'll decide if we need to layer a little more on. I don't know. I'm debating. But it's not bad, but not very much. Actually, you know what? I think I want to add a little more navy. Just like a tiny bit more. And I'm gonna shift the zip tie again to give us at the bottom just this blue-ish part right there. So that way, to leave like the purple out, and we're only gonna put in a tiny bit more. 4 more milliliters. Rinsing that out, stirring it up, and really we're gonna put a tiny bit of yarn in because I want to increase the blue on that little bit of blue area that we have and not necessarily increase the purple, and still hoping to maintain some white. So the goal here is to dip in just like this little bit here. And so this is going to take a little more care because I really this time don't want to go too far. But I want to give the yarn access to it. So I'm going to have just that tiny bit in. The rest of the yarn is out. Stirring this up, and we have plenty of white for our spruce. For our forest green. I think for the forest green, wow, there's really still not that much blue, but I think it's a little bit more, and I think we're good. With the forest green, that color, we'll probably want to start with 20 milliliters of dye, I think, just because the color is less potent than everything else we've used thus far. But anyway, I'm gonna wait about 15 minutes. Okay, it's not been the full 15 minutes, but I think just about all of this dye has absorbed. There. There's still like a hint of maybe some red. I'm trying to remove as much of the water as I can. And we're gonna set up for our final color. And this time with the zip ties, because I want to leave no white in here, I'm gonna move the zip tie such that we have the white at the very bottom, like so. Okay, so like a hint of the red, but the white is present at the bottom. This time we've got 20 milliliters of our dye, which is still not very much considering that we have 300 grams of yarn. And again, I would call this like a medium tone colorway versus a pastel. But you know, it just goes to show that for a pastel, you really want to start, if you don't know how much of the dye to use, you want to start with a tiny amount and build it up. And for that, I would make a stock solution that is less than 1%, because let's start dipping. When we have our 1% stock solution like we have here, it does give us like the ability to add less dye, but it is a lot harder to consistently measure out like 1 milliliter of dye. You can do that like with a syringe and things like that. Ooh, that's pretty. So it can be done. I'm dipping it a little further just to remove any white best I can. We may end up adding more, but I'm actually going to sort of leave this, hopefully not making too much of a mess, and then we'll see if we want more color. But I think I'll just go ahead and hop in front of the camera to finish my point. In this video, I got great pastels of these three colors using remnant amount of dye. No idea how much I had there. So I had a feeling 10 milliliters would be too much, but we didn't look at depths of shade of each of these colors to give us a feel of how little dye we would need. And so starting at, say even 1/4% and going down from there can help you figure out, okay, how little dye you need for a pastel. But say you need 1/4 milliliter of dye. That's really hard to measure with tools most of us have access to. So you can take your dye stock and say, take 100 milliliters of your 1% stock solution and add that to 900 milliliters of water. Now you have a 0.1% stock solution, or the equivalent of 0.1 grams of dye per 100 milliliters. And so then using equations, which I talk about in the math of yarn dyeing, you can use much larger volumes, which are much easier to precisely measure out, to then get your little amounts of dye and then achieve some consistency with a more pastel result. And so this does not feel pastel, but total 20 plus 15 plus 10. So we've used about 45 milliliters total of a 1% stock solution. 0.45 grams of dye on 300 grams of yarn. That's about 0.15 grams of dye per 100 grams, which isn't very much dye at all. And we're still not pastel. So I would need to go, I think, a couple orders of magnitude below this to get these as pastels. Now, the other issue that comes up with pastels is if you have a color that strikes really quickly. And these aren't striking that fast, but if they were, then you have another problem on your hands, because as soon as you dip, you're gonna get some dye on the most outer edge of the yarn and nothing towards the middle. So you're also gonna wanna use a really large volume of water, so that way when the yarn goes in, it slows down the absorption a little bit more. So anyway, I hope this little pastel digression may help a little bit if you are planning out your own colorways. But let's go check back in on the yarn. Okay, our forest green, I would say, is a bit lighter than the rest of the colors, but I actually don't mind. Let me give you a sense of all the colors together really quickly. I still want to set them more, but this is what we're working with. So we've got a lot of depth and it is lighter. I think it's beautiful and fun though, so I'm gonna roll with it. Now, at this stage, there's still a hint of something in the pot, but I'm also gonna go ahead and add all of our yarn because I would like to set it all a bit longer. So I am now going to let this heat for 30 minutes. May as well add a little bit more acid, but I'm gonna go ahead and let this heat for 30 minutes and then let it cool so then we can go wash it. Finally, we are gonna take this residual dye, and there's not a lot of dye here, and take it to the pot that we used for our dip dyed colorway that was more medium toned. I think we're gonna end up with something very pastel. There's really, really not a lot here. But we're gonna see what we end up with to leave no dye behind for one last colorway for this part 1 color challenge. I removed half of the water from the pot that we had been using previously because we have 15 cups of water, which actually have 15 tablespoons of white vinegar that we will be adding to this. I added in a skein of pre-soaked stroll and then brought over the dyes and started pouring them on. I didn't think the colors would necessarily strike that quickly. The pot was warm to start with, but I'm adding room temperature / cool water to it. But I was curious what kind of depth and dimension we might get in a pastel. Most of these cups are reddish, but we do have some blues in here as well. And I just didn't really know what direction the color would go. It's not a surprise that we're at something fairly purpley, given what was left. I'm curious how tonal this will be versus semi-solid, but I'm gonna let this come up to a light simmer and heat for 30 minutes. It has been 30 minutes and then some. And Where's my zip tie? Here we are. What's interesting is that there's still a little bit of something in the water, but I'm not going to leave this in there because we have a lovely pastel purple here, and I don't know if whatever's left just won't absorb. And I do see multiple tones in here. I see areas that are more blue and areas that are more pink. This is very subtle and pretty. And I'll wash it with the rest of the yarn once things are cool. Washing our dip guide and bonus yarn. It's fun to see that that purple we got from that very end is much bluer than our Cabernet purple color, which is not really maroon. I really thought it was going to be more maroon. Given that I clearly didn't pick the right red, I want to use these same 3 colors for the color challenge part 2, but please let me know what red I should have picked, and I'll use that for a future video. Let's add a little bit, some clear dish soap. I mean, I really should have known from my pink swatch video. I think that I did look at some deep reds, but maybe not a lot, because I still plan to do a red leaning comparison video at some point, but this is looking great. I am so glad there isn't a big bleeder in our list this time, but anyway, I am going to finish rinsing out the soap, put this through my spin dryer, and hang it up to dry. Here are the colors from the first round of this color challenge, where we used dark navy, forest green, and Cabernet to create a lot of different colorways. We have a yarn mop, a speckled colorway, dip dyed colorways, and then even some single color tonals. These speckles are a lot of fun, and as dry powders, the 3 colors have a lot of really good balance to one another. Sure, I was going for larger speckles a little bit intentionally. I didn't mix the dyes in with citric acid, and so that is something that we can explore for the next version. I am in love with our yarn mop from doing those speckles. We started with some pastel, some very slight amounts of these colors from making up some dye stocks, and having that as the base, having a bit of a variegated base to then wipe my hands on, to wipe that dye onto, created something super, super pretty, and I really, really like it. Now that all of this yarn is dry, I can see more of a difference between all of these Cabernet heavy colors. But let's take a brief step back. Here are the 3 colors we are playing with for our color challenge at a 1% depth of shade. You can see that both the Cabernet and dark navy are extremely pigmented. And forest green is a deep color, but it's a lot less pigmented than I always think that it is. I always forget that it's a little bit blue leaning, even though I should know that. But I think that to have this to feel depth-wise on par with the navy and Cabernet, I would increase it to a 1.5 or even a 2% depth of shade. Looking at this part of the triangle, it's funny to see how similar of an impact the forest green has to the navy. I mean, granted, it's less saturated, but both of them are making that deep red more purple. And that's pretty fun. It's pretty cool that this isn't brown, but the reason why the lots of green with a little bit of red isn't brown, and it's instead a more muted purple, just comes down to the proportion of everything. Now, the 3 colors here in the middle are extremely similar. In fact, I think they are the most similar of everything that we have here. But there's a clear indication that they're very, very purple. And when you have, I guess, 2 parts blue, 1 part green, 1 part red, all that blue will bring you more to a cooler toned purple, but otherwise they are very much weighted with this bottom section. As far as breaking this up into sets, this is an obvious one to me. That's one I can see myself dyeing over and over again. And then I think I may do not sure, because these two are very similar. Let me see how they look sort of straight. Yeah, I think I will keep the sets like that, but this 1% burgundy, I'm gonna pop over there. I think that progression works a little bit better. These are both extremely subtle sets, but I think that they're still very cute. Our dip dyed 3 times colorway isn't exactly a pastel, but it is very medium toned. I'm really happy I ended up doing dip dyeing for this instead of just painting it in the pan, because it both gave me a little bit more control over how the colors blended together, but it also gave like some smoother transitions than if I was pouring dye onto it. There would be more variation in there. So it's just different and not something I do as much anymore. But if you would like to see me do more dip dyeing, please leave a comment below. And finally, we have a actual pastel lavender colorway, and there are bits that are more navy and bits that are a little bit more pink throughout here. It's very, very subtle and has a lot of dimension to it. This one is really a bonus. I'm not really counting it as much for the color challenge because it doesn't really incorporate the green very much at all, but I still like it, and it goes really, really well with a lot of the other colors that we have here, especially this mop right here. I think these two skeins would pair really, really well together. And so here we have it, the first colorways I created for this color challenge. Which one of them is your favorite? And what other techniques would you like to see in a color challenge moving forward? It's currently the middle of January, and ChemKnits patrons are voting for the techniques that they want me to do for part 2 of this color challenge. So if you're not already a ChemKnits patron, by the time you're seeing this video, I've probably already started filming part 2. But I still want to hear your suggestions and color combinations for color challenges moving forward, because I find the exercise of trying to come up with different ways to combine 3 different colors to be really, really exciting. And I already have some ideas of what I want to do for part 2, and I'm really excited to share that with you. Speaking of ChemKnits patrons, I would like to give a huge shout out and thank you to Karen Siegel, Jessica Parko, Don Jans, Tamaris Vanez, Janine, and the rest of the Fiber patrons. Some of the names are up on the screen right now. Patreon is a really great platform where you can help support the content here on the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel, and in return there are some fun perks, including early access to new content, behind the scenes sneak peeks, and even advanced notice of shop restocks, which comes in handy when I'm planning a special series or event. You can find more information at patreon.com/ChemKnits. I will also have a link down in the video description. To all of my patrons, thank you so much for being a part of this community. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and please subscribe. That is the absolute biggest way that you can help support the content here. Subscribing, giving thumbs up to videos, leaving comments, and overall just even watching the content really does help the channel so much. So thank you so much for joining me on all of my color journeys. I post new videos at least twice a week, and there's a lot more colors I have to explore. Thank you so much for watching.